Deputy Callaghan. Now, Deputy Boyd Barrett, you're sharing with colleagues.
Yes, Deputy Murphy and Deputy Barry. Minister, the government has unprecedented resources at its disposal that could have delivered a transformative budget to resolve the housing catastrophe that this country is facing, to address the crisis in our health service and the cost of living crisis, and to eradicate poverty. But instead of doing that, you've given us a splurge of once-off measures to buy a general election, and next year we'll be back where we started. That's the reality of this budget, trying to dazzle people with once-off measures, but not actually deal with the disastrous crisis we face in housing and homelessness, in health, in the cost of living, with the poverty that exists and the inequality that exists in our society, when you had the resources to do it. The most shocking failure really is in the area of housing, which is the mother of all crises we face in this country and which impacts at so many different levels, not just in terms of the housing misery and hardship that more than 14,000 people face in homelessness, or the well over 100,000 households who are on housing waiting lists, waiting for a decade or sometimes 2 decades for a social home, or the tens of thousands of young working people who can never hope to afford their own home, or the many, many tens of thousands who are paying absolutely extortionate rents. And really, this budget, with all those resources that you had at your disposal, has done absolutely nothing to address the housing catastrophe we face. Frankly, even I'm shocked at your failure on housing. The government figures given out today in the budget are that, incredibly, after the Housing Commission said we need to double our housing output, and that means at least doubling the social and affordable housing output, have announced the same figures for social and affordable housing next year as this year, with no change on the Housing for All plan that has failed so disastrously. So last year, the target was 10,000 social homes and 6,000 affordable homes. The target next year, 10,000 social homes, 6,000 affordable homes. No change. Absolutely incredible. You're planning to put an additional €4 billion on top of what you've just put into the Future Ireland Fund and the Infrastructure Fund before the end of the year, instead of putting that money into doubling the amount of social and affordable housing we need to deliver next year and for at least 5 or 10 years after that. I mean, I find it absolutely stunning and it explains why the government never refused for 6 months to discuss the Housing Commission report. Refused point blank. Because the consequences of actually having a discussion on that would have been to admit, as the Commission has outlined, that the Housing for All plan is less than half of what is actually necessary to deliver an absolutely catastrophic housing and homelessness crisis, which is getting worse by the day. And that requires us to at least double the amount of social and affordable housing output. No action in the budget to deal with the unaffordable rents that are being charged, now well over €2,000 a month, a paltry increase in the tax credit, But all of this is money that is going into the corporate landlords' pockets while the rents are racing up. So it will make no difference. It'll just about keep people at the same level of extortionate rent that they're already at. But what is necessary is for us to cut rents or to deliver social and affordable housing on the scale necessary not to have people dependent on these vulture funds and corporate landlords who are charging rents that no reasonable person could be expected to pay or afford. No action to deal with the unaffordable house prices. So whatever additional money is going into Help to Buy or any of these other schemes is money that's just going to pour into the developers' pockets and into the vulture funds' pockets. No action to deal with the profiteering and speculation of those that control land and the supply of housing in this country. And to my mind, shamefully, when you have the money available, the capital resources available to establish a state construction company that could actually build social and affordable housing on the public land bank, you have failed to do that. So we will remain dependent on private developers and private investors to deliver the supply of housing, even most of the social and affordable housing, where we're still dependent on those private contractors and private developers, when even in the best will in the world, they don't have the capacity to deliver what's necessary. They don't have the scale, even if they wanted to, and what they deliver is in any event too expensive, coming in at shockingly high prices. I mean, the Shangana development in my area sums it up: 340 to 380,000 euro for so-called affordable housing. That's not affordable. But that's only what they are capable of delivering. Because you won't deal with the fundamental problem that people who are out for profit control the land bank and are controlling the supply of housing and indeed control the capacity to build that housing and are only interested in the profit they can make from other people's housing misery. What we needed was to use this money to develop a state construction company, to build on public land, and to control the profiteering of those charging exorbitant rents and exorbitant house prices, and of course to stop the flow, not a budgetary measure, but to stop the flow of people into homelessness who are being evicted from the private rented sector. The health service, the government boasting that it has boosted the budget, and indeed it has gone up in nominal terms from 22 billion to 25 billion, or 22.3 to 25.3. But of course, when you take into account that you massively under-budgeted last year for health, and then had to introduce a supplementary budget of 1.5 billion, and you take into account inflation, and my God, you're certainly not able to control health inflation when you look at the National Children's Hospital, never mind bike sheds and all the rest of it, the scale of inflation on the National Children's Hospital, and then you add into that demographic changes, an older population and all the rest of it, it is clear there is not enough here to stem the crisis that exists in our health service and the misery of nearly 1 million people waiting for procedures, the chaos in our emergency departments, the chronic understaffing in our hospitals and in multiple areas of our health service, whether it's our CAMS teams, whether it's our child and disability networks, whether it's public health nurses, deficits in all of these areas and so many more. These are not going to be addressed. And of course, in the last year, as I and I think Forza workers are going out protesting later this week about it in the health service, is that the government, having announced the lifting of the recruitment embargo that you had imposed on the health service, had actually, in June of this year, reintroduced that embargo under a different name, the Pay and Numbers Strategy. A staff ceiling, maximum staff ceiling on the numbers that could be recruited into the health service, which again is going to be imposed next year at 133,000 according to the budget book. Now, the Minister is saying, well, that's 3,000 up on last year, but as the INMO pointed out, the Pay and Numbers staff ceiling that was imposed in June, setting staffing levels at the level they were in December 2023, meant that this year, as a consequence, just in nursing and midwifery alone, there was an effective cut of 2,000 staff in nurses and midwives in terms of whole-time equivalents. And I'm sure when you look at the rest of the areas of understaffing, chronic understaffing, that will more than account for the so-called increases that we're looking at. The reality is you're imposing a ceiling which has nothing to do with patient safety. That has nothing to do with safe staffing numbers, which is what our healthcare workers and professionals have been telling us. And of course, it's obvious when you go into the hospitals, maternity leave has not been covered in many of the hospitals, sick leave has not been covered in many of the hospitals. When people retire, people aren't being recruited by and large to replace them, and people are being pulled all over the hospital to cover for lack of staffing in one area as against another, often people doing things that they're not even trained to do, endangering patient safety. That's the reality of what's going on, and it results from the imposition of an effective embargo by setting these staff ceilings. And there is nothing in this that suggests that you have any intention of increasing staffing levels and sanctioning the posts and recruiting the people necessary to get us up to safe staffing levels, which is what, of course, should be the baseline for the funding of the health service. What is going to ensure patient safety? What is going to ensure that there are conditions for the health workers themselves that do not leave them completely demoralised, stressed and overrun? Many of whom, the situation being so bad, they just don't want to work in the health service and head off to other countries. The mental health budget, still less than 6% of the overall health budget, even though it has been stated time and time again that we need to get the mental health budget up to at least 10% of the overall health budget. Hello.
You get another 10 minutes.
Another 10 minutes. Another really shocking feature of a budget where you have this enormous surplus of more than 20 billion euro, another projected surplus of 9 billion next year, and very importantly against the background of absolutely staggering increases in the profits of the big corporations in this country and of enormous accumulation in the wealth of the very richest in Irish society that have taken place under the successive Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael governments over the last 10 or 15 years, where we have the resources that could actually eliminate poverty and give working people a break, you've given them crumbs. Crumbs. The Anti-Poverty Network, for example, looking at the increase, the €12 increase, said that in order to get the real value of the basic social welfare or pension payment just back to the level that it was in 2020, you would have needed a minimum of a €20 increase on the base payment. And you've given 12. That's just to get it back to where we were in 2020. So people remain and will remain in poverty. That €12 will not even cover the accumulated cost of living hikes that people have endured and suffered over the last number of years since the cost of living crisis took off. a period during which, I repeat, profits went through the roof and the accumulation of the wealth in the hands of the richest in this country increased absolutely dramatically. As we highlighted in our alternative budget, profits over the last 10 years have gone up by 294%. 294%. But people on social welfare and pension payments are still going to be worse off than they were in 2020. It's disgraceful. Absolutely disgraceful. We proposed in our budget to raise everybody on a social welfare or pension payment above the poverty level, where we have about 700 to 800,000 people living in or below, in or around or below the poverty level, to bring them all above that poverty level by having a minimum payment of €300 and a cost of disability payment of an additional 50 to cover the enormous cost of disability. You had the resources to do it, but you refused to do it. Because you're interested in looking after the super wealthy rather than eliminating poverty when you have the resources available to you. And I know you're shaking your head, and I suspect, you see, people don't even know just the extent of the tax expenditures and tax write-offs that go to the giant multinational corporations, because we don't discuss them. And I still don't see them. I don't know if we're going to see them over the next day or two. I certainly didn't see them in the budget package about tax expenditures, the shadow budget of tax reliefs, most of which go to the big corporations. Where's the list of them detailing how much is going to them next year? But we know we go to the bother of bringing this up at the Budget Scrutiny Committee and detailing some of them in our alternative budget. And they are quite staggering. The figures are always a year or two behind, but they are quite staggering. So, for example, in 2022, capital allowances to the big corporations, €101 billion. Intergroup transactions, €4 billion in tax expenditures. Losses, including capital allowances brought forward, so where these big wealthy corporations get to write off tax based on previous losses, €16 billion. Research and development tax credit going overwhelmingly to the big corporations, €1.1 billion. I won't go through the entire list, but they're enormous, and they bring down the taxable profits of the big corporations by tens and tens of billions of euro, meaning they pay, in reality, not the 12.5% they're supposed to pay, but about 7%. 7%, and some of them, as we know from Apple, paying considerably less than that. You didn't even want to take that money off them. You fought not to take that money off them, and now that we've got that money, there's virtually nothing additional been done with it. It's gone into the Future Ireland Fund and the Infrastructure Fund to be done we don't know what with. And the money that has been mentioned, the €3 billion, of that, it's not at all clear what it's going to be done with it. €1 billion is going to go to the LDA, some extra money going into energy and so on, but what is it actually going to be spent on? And when you consider the LDA, the slowness of the LDA in actually delivering social and affordable housing and the cost at which it's delivering it, it's really debatable if it's going to, in any significant way, increase the delivery or the affordability of the social and affordable housing they're supposed to deliver. For workers, 80 cent for those on minimum wage. 80 cent extra in the minimum wage. And actually, I was looking at the Minister's budget book. Somebody on €25,000 is going to get about €1,400 extra this year, mostly because of the small increase in the minimum wage. Their tax liability is going to be slightly more than it was last year, which is interesting. So the tax changes you brought in have favoured the higher income earners, but you contrast that 1,400, which again won't even keep pace in reality with inflation and with the cost of living hikes, but people on 100, according to your budget book, people on 127,000, I think was one of the examples, or 125,000, another one of 114,000, are going to gain more in the budget, the taxation changes, than somebody on the minimum wage. Absolutely disgraceful. So no real effort to address the problem of the working poor in this country, the lowest paid workers, but the people at the top of the income distribution going to do considerably better. Higher education I just want to mention as well. All that we get in that area, now I think people need to think about this, right? The biggest problem we have, or one of the biggest problems, along with the housing crisis, although it's significantly connected to the housing crisis, are skills shortages at the moment in the country. Now, I cannot for the life of me understand why, when we need to get thousands, tens of thousands, more people qualified in a whole number of areas, the construction trades, professions, in healthcare, professions, in teaching, and you can go through the list. In almost every area, in the caring professions, we need more people qualified. But instead of using all this money to eliminate the financial obstacles and barriers to people getting qualified, we've done virtually nothing. Absolutely miserable. You've maintained a once-off €1,000 cut in the registration fee and a once-off 33% reduction in the apprentice contribution, and there's some vague mention of action on postgrad stipends, although it's not clear what it actually is. Now, with all the resources available to you, to me it is just obvious you would abolish all fees. You would get rid of all fees that are financial obstacles to people getting qualified in higher and further education, in the trades and professions and so on, where we need to get people qualified, and there would be substantial additional money for student accommodation, not just to provide more of it, but to make it genuinely affordable, which currently it's not. Even when on-campus accommodation is built, it is at completely unaffordable rents for many students. So we need genuinely free higher and further education, but you've done virtually nothing with all these resources at your disposal to genuinely increase access, create more places, and remove the financial barriers and obstacles to people getting qualified in these areas. Arts, culture and sports, some minor increases, but it's just about inflation. 3%, 6% in total in arts, culture and sports increase. 3% in the arts and culture area, again, that's just about standing still. It's not actually any significant real increase in the money that will be available, and it's certainly not going to address the problem of widespread precarity and poverty among the vast majority of people who are engaged in the arts, in music, in performance in this country. We propose, for example, that everybody who applied for the basic income for artists should get it. Everybody. As opposed to just the pilot scheme. All you're proposing is to, by a few months, extend the pilot scheme, which has only been given to a fraction of the number of artists and performers and people who work in the arts who actually applied in the first place for that support. And you could, you have the resources to do it, and you could indeed, as we suggested, impose taxes on the social media companies, on the big IT companies, to fund the arts, culture, public service broadcasting in a way that would guarantee security and decent incomes for people who work in the area of arts. I could go on, but my time is up. It is really more of the same from the government. more of the same, continue the big tax reliefs and tax credits for the big corporations, protect the interests of the super rich, do nothing to redistribute the unprecedented wealth and profits that are being made in this country, to eliminate poverty, to give working people a decent break on the cost of living crisis, and to deliver the social and affordable housing and decent health service and public services that people need and deserve in this country.
Okay, that's grand. Deputy Murphy.
Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. Minister Chambers earlier spoke about the Apple tax money having, quote, the capacity to be transformational. He didn't mention, and neither did Minister O'Donoghue actually, that, as Richard has pointed out, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael fought tooth and nail not to take this transformative amount of money, to say that 14 billion euros should stay on the cash pile of one of the biggest, richest corporations in the world. Didn't mention either that they wasted 10 million euros of public money in fighting that case. What happened around Apple tax, I think people will remember. It will be a focal point of the coming general election because it epitomises the reality of politics and the class nature of the society we live in, where, in the words of James Connolly, governments are committees of the rich to manage the affairs of the capitalist class. That the truth of it is that this government puts the profits of big corporations like Apple, big developers, big corporate landlords before the needs of ordinary people. That's the essence of the sort of government that they are. But in any case, now, against your own wishes, we have the money. And actually, I agree with Jack Chambers, this has the capacity to be transformational. But is anyone in the government actually making the case that this is a transformational budget? Where are the transformational changes in this budget? I mean, there's nothing that can be trumpeted as transformational. A few once-off payments, which we'll get to, a few tax breaks, which we'll get to. But where is the state construction company in the context of an unprecedented housing crisis, of record house prices, of record levels of homelessness, of record levels of rent? Where's the public childcare? Public provision of childcare for free at the point of access, in the context of families spending an extra mortgage every month for one kid, an extra 2 mortgages a month for 2 kids. Where's the investment in public transport, in renewable energy, in retrofitting, in the context of the climate catastrophe that we are heading towards? No mention of the building of a national health service, no provision for a special class in every school across the country. There's nothing in this budget that can be pointed at as being transformational. In fact, it's the opposite of a transformational budget. A series of once-off, sometimes twice-off, measures for ordinary people, social welfare, child benefit, reduction in student fees. Even the reduction of public transport fees is continued on a once-off basis. It's the biggest scam ever, this once-off business, where the government gets to come in year after year, announce the same measure that they announced the previous year and expect to get some applause for it. All a very obvious ploy to try and continue the 100-year rule of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. So once-off measures for ordinary people. Permanent tax breaks for the wealthy of various sorts. So we have an extension of the angel investor relief. I'm sure millions of people across the country are breathing a sigh of relief that their angel investments will attract tax relief. Extra incentives, the employment investment incentive, the startup relief for entrepreneurs, startup capital incentive, a series of extensions, capital gains tax relief, a new extension of relief for incorporated farms, in other words, agribusiness. And Fine Gael just put out a tweet, which I agree with their tweet. The tweet is a graphic saying Fine Gael is backing business. And one of the headline points that they're highlighting to show how they're backing business proudly: no increase in sick leave days, brackets, which were due to double in January. I mean, in what world is it a bad thing to increase sick day leave? In terms of public health, in terms of workers' rights. But Fine Gael thinks it's a bad thing to do something that was promised. When they originally introduced the sick pay legislation, we said, wait a minute, it's not baked into the legislation that the number of days will increase and increase in the way that you're saying. And the government said, no, you don't need to worry about that, we'll do it by ministerial order. And now, precisely as we warned, you're not doing it. And why? Because Fine Gael is backing business.
Disgraceful.
Backing business at the expense of workers. That's exactly what you're doing. And the reason that this government is not going to introduce a transformative budget, or the next government, if you were returned, is because you will not break from your reliance on the market. In other words, you will not break from the prioritisation of profit for Apple, for the corporate landlords, for the private developers, for the private health insurers, for the private hospital providers. Their profit comes before the needs of people affected by the housing crisis, the health crisis, the crisis in terms of additional needs, and so on. What is required is planning, is public ownership, is putting people's needs first, and you're absolutely allergic to that. To go into a bit more detail on some of the areas, in terms of young people, I mean, if anything demonstrates that this is an attempt to buy the election, it is your treatment of young people. Because you're not attempting to buy young people. You're attempting to drive young people out of the country. There's almost nothing in this budget for young people because you've given up on attracting their votes. Your best hope is to simply drive them out. So take the issue of job seekers allowance for young people. It was one of the horrific measures introduced in the context of the crisis, was to separate out, to create a new rate for under 25s, cutting the dole for people under 25. 16 years later, this discrimination against young people continue. In the context of this massive budget surplus, you're continuing with this discrimination, leaving some young people increasingly driven to live at home because of the housing crisis on €141.70. The issue of so-called sub-minimum wage rates. Passed by this Dáil well over a year ago, then delayed by a year by a bill that we introduced to get rid of these exploitative rates, allowing people to be paid less than the minimum wage. The Low Pay Commission unanimously recommends the end of these sub-minimum wage rates. And there's nothing here in the budget. You're going to continue with these sub-minimum wage rates, allowing the legal super-exploitation of thousands of young workers, allowing them to be paid as little as $9.45. In terms of education, what sums it up is the fact INTO has pointed out that more money has been allocated to the gimmick of this smartphone pouchers. You're giving more money for the smartphone pouches to grab a cheap headline than you're giving in terms of increasing capitation for primary schools. I mean, that is absolutely scandalous and demonstrates the lack of priority put on young people. The government refused to introduce a second tier of child benefit for the poorest children in the state, as called for by all the major child welfare and child poverty organisations, including the Children's Rights Allowance. There's a stingy €4 increase to the qualified child allowance for children under 12 and €8 for children 12, and no increase to monthly child benefit rates, doing nothing to address the rates of child poverty situation in this country. 1 in 10 families are reliant on food banks to survive. There's some talk of celebrating the idea that new parents are getting a so-called baby boost of a payment of €420. I can tell from experience that €420 will not go very far. What will go far, to those who need it the least, is the tax benefit that you're giving to the richest 3% of households in terms of cutting inheritance tax. Certainly the real baby boost to them, gaining a tax benefit of €21,450. Finish with the nothing that is here in terms of the environment. A transformational amount of money to shift the whole nature of the economy, to have a rapid, just transition that improves people's lives. And almost nothing here. Nothing substantial in terms of massive rollout of renewable energy. We should be hearing today about new train lines across the country. We should be hearing today about new metros, about new Lewises. We should be hearing about free public transport right across the board, instead of the meagre increase for a very small number of children. Nothing like that whatsoever. The final thing I'll say, the only glint of light in this budget and what we've seen today, I think, is definite evidence for people a general election is coming, and it's coming very, very soon. It's no accident, I think, that payments are due to be rolled out next month and in November. I think it's pretty clear from what's happening today, we're facing an election in the next 6, 7, 8 weeks. That's people's opportunity. I don't think they'll be fooled by this budget. Their opportunity to end 100 years of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, to end 5,000 continuous days of Fine Gael in one form or another, and to elect a left government.
Deputy Barry.